Should we listen to Liz Truss's warnings about China? Can we solve the housing crisis by building on the green belt? And can Rishi Sunak really get changes to the European Court of Human Rights? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Robert Buckland, Labour's Sarah Champion, Anoosh Chakalian from The New Statesman and The Spectator's Katie Balls. Today,
the house building failure of the government is killing the dream for many people who simply want that security of their own roof over their head.
Keir Starmer promises to get tough on planning reform and even says Labour would build on the green belt. The European Court blocked this plane from taking migrants to Rwanda last summer. Now Rishi Sunak says the court has to change.
We need to do more to cooperate across borders and across jurisdictions to end illegal migration and stop the boats.
We need to step up that economic engagement with our key allies to be able to make sure that China isn't able to bully and coerce countries.
Liz Truss is in Taiwan, warning about China. But will the government here listen to her? And at Prime Minister's Questions, Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden will face Labour's Angela Rayner for the first time. Let's start with the former Prime Minister, Liz Truss, and her speech in Taiwan and her visit there. BBC News headline, Truss urges Sunak to class China as threat to UK security. And this is the headline in The Times. Liz Truss in Taiwan, China is the biggest threat to the free world. She wants to see her successor, Rishi Sunak, take a much tougher line when it comes to the UK's dealings with China. My question for the panel, starting with Robert Buckland, is Liz Truss worth listening to anymore?
Well, look, she was a former Foreign Secretary. She's got a lot of experience in government. I don't think it should be about her. I think it's more important to focus on the issue which she raises, which is the challenge of China. China behaves in a unilateral way on a range of issues, most notably artificial intelligence, which is something that I think we all need to be very concerned about. Sure. And therefore it's right to meet that challenge with strength. The problem is, if you talk tough, you've got to be able to back it up. Right. And that is where I think we need just to be careful when we talk in those terms. Right. So should we listen to what she has to say on this in terms of strengthening the rhetoric and possibly the action towards China? Well, look, I share a lot of her concerns. I think there's quite a strong view in the Conservative Party that does want to see us be very clear about the challenge and sometimes the threat that China poses in many areas. Is Liz Truss worth listening to anymore?
I find this a very indulgent, dangerous game because Taiwan is a fantastic democracy and a great trading partner with Britain. But what Truss is doing is upping the heat in that area without having any power to actually intervene. She was Foreign Secretary, she was Prime Minister. She could have done all this on her watch. Instead, what she's doing is trying to rebrand herself. And I worry it's at the expense of that region. Right. I mean, she wasn't Prime Minister, of course, for very long, as we know rather famously, or infamously, I should say. Anoosh, on this issue, I mean, Sarah and Robert obviously are right. It's very sensitive. China feels very much that Taiwan belongs to it. So going there in the way that Nancy Pelosi did, I think it was last year, possibly the year before, also was quite a sensitive, provocative thing to do from China's perspective. But is Liz Truss worth listening to from a UK government's perspective?
Well, if I were the UK government, if I were Rishi Sunak right now, I would think that this was a bit of a political headache, because not only is she bringing to the fore the splits within the Conservative Party over the UK government's line on China. I mean, Rishi Sunak and the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, have been trying to sort of smooth diplomatic relations with China recently. But also Liz Truss in the news, in the headlines, in photo opportunities. That's a bit of a nightmare for Rishi Sunak, because he's been trying to separate himself and his government from her disastrous time in office. Right. Do you think they are listening to her at all?
I don't think Liz Truss is particularly impacting the government's China policy. I think that, as you allude to, she was Foreign Secretary for longer than Prime Minister, so it makes sense as an area when she's trying to build that career. But if you want to know what Rishi Sunak's going to do, I think it's better to look at, for example, what the White House is saying on China than what Liz Truss is. That has a greater impact on UK foreign policy.
And I think that's the frustration for me. It's a time when we need to have a clear policy. We need to be putting out what our messages are in a coherent way. And Liz Truss has basically undermined what James Cleverly said 2 weeks ago. She's weakening Rishi Sunak's hand, and that puts all of us in a vulnerable position.
But Rishi Sunak, when you say you want to have clarity on this issue from the government, I mean, Robert, is the government in the right place? Because when he was campaigning to be leader, Rishi Sunak said China was the biggest long-term threat facing the world, or words pretty well to that effect. Now he's in government, he says it's a systemic challenge. I mean, has he gone soft on China?
No, I don't think so. And I don't think there's an inconsistency. What he's saying there is a long-term threat, which is talking about, some of the developments that we're seeing that will take time. Don't forget, China play a very long game on issues like Taiwan. They're prepared to be patient and to wait. They waited on Hong Kong. They will do the same with Taiwan. And as Katie says, look at what the White House is saying. This White House is quite hawkish on China. And I think, to reiterate the point I made, you can be very hawkish, but if you aren't prepared to back it up with actions, Chinese are not going to take that seriously. So, we have to tread carefully. Right.
Is there an issue with backseat drivers, as in former prime ministers? Because there are quite a lot of them, aren't there?
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly an issue. I actually think it was a bigger issue for Rishi Sunak at the beginning of the year. And she's completely right that pictures of Liz Truss on the front of the newspapers is not something Downing Street wants to see, or Boris Johnson for that matter. And if you look at what some local councillors, local government are saying after the local elections in terms of the really bad losses for the Tories, they say that Boris Johnson and Liz Truss came up repeatedly on the doorstep as part of the chaos of last year. So it's unhelpful from that perspective. I do think that at the beginning of the year, it was a lot more, well, when are these people going to make their move? And almost as soon as you start doing it, it's often a case of diminishing returns in the sense that, the first appearance can have the biggest impact. And on the Boris Johnson front, you look at the Conservative Democratic Organisation event on Saturday, the CDO, and it was not, I don't think, the rallying cry moment that some in the Tory party who don't want Boris Johnson to come back had feared. Instead, it was actually quite almost a post-mortem on what's gone wrong rather than a bring Boris back type event. So I think the threat is actually diminishing a little bit for Rishi Sunak, but it's still unhelpful.
Just before we leave this, Sarah, in terms of clarity, if Keir Starmer becomes Prime Minister after the next election, what sort of language do you think he should use? Should he toughen it up and see China as a threat or just a challenge?
I think we need to be realistic. I think we need an audit on where our strengths and weaknesses are in relation to it. So there are some great things about China. There are great trading opportunities in both directions, but there are inherent risks. So things like our supply chains are heavily, heavily dependent on China. Solar particular, we know that there's modern slavery going on there. We need to have a very strong stance on that with any deal that we do going forward. So it's a grown-up conversation rather than these knee-jerk headlines for me.
Let's talk about housing, because it's certainly moved up the political agenda, rightly in the minds of many people. On the front page here, Keir Starmer, I'll allow more homes on the Green Belt. Yes, in the interview, he says, give local authorities, local areas more power to decide where it will be and you alleviate that problem, talking about housing. So it's not as binary or straightforward as Green Belt, not Green Belt. It's how you direct where the housing will be. It wasn't just a suggestion on building on the Green Belt from the Conservatives. This headline in The Sun from the Housing Secretary, Michael Gove, migration blow to owning home. He said in an interview that soaring migration is one of the reasons that millions of Brits are being locked out of the housing market. But let's go back, first of all, to Keir Starmer's suggestion about building houses on the Green Belt. Should we?
Look, I think that we've got a very, very glib response to a long-term problem. If Labour want to swing the pendulum back to the John Prescott era of top-down targets, good luck with that.
Oh, so you're talking about the mandatory targets that Rishi Sunak dropped?
Well, yeah, which is actually underlying all of this, where Labour want to go on this. Look, you cannot, I think, carry on in this sort of make-believe world where housing can just be imposed without any meaningful community engagement. Now, I've seen examples in my own area in Swindon where we build, and we build with the consent of residents and we build well. Now, we can do it, but what we won't take kindly to is the loss of the green space around our lovely town, which it seems to me the Labour policy is entirely envisaging with top-down targets.
Sarah?
Well, it's not a Labour policy, and it's also a reaction to the renter reform bill, which is coming through, which...
What's not a Labour policy?
Building on Greenbelt.
Right. What about the mandatory housing targets? That is something Keir Starmer wants to reintroduce. I mean, it was the government's policy as well until quite recently.
I don't feel uncomfortable with that. What I feel uncomfortable with is if it is forced upon people. So at the moment we have the local plan, and what we're finding with the local plan is there are very fixed targets. So it really sort of shackles councils about what they can and can't do. When I speak to my local councillors, they know their wards, they know where there are brownfield sites, they know where there are opportunities. And the other thing that I really don't want is loads of executive homes. What I want is affordable housing. What I want is proper social housing. What I want is council housing, because that's how you sort of manage the rental market.
So are you in favour of mandatory housing targets?
I'm going to say yes, if they are done in proper consultation.
Right.
Because unless you have a target, all that we have is warm words.
Right, OK, so you are in favour of the idea of a target. I mean, mandatory does mean it would be enforced, I presume, on local councils, possibly with engagement. I mean, without it, how do you build houses? They're just not built. We've seen it over decades.
Well, look, I can analyse the Town and Country Planning Act from the 1940s.
No, please don't.
No, he really can.
I would love to, because I think the whole system is absolutely in a hell of a mess. It's been amended to death. What we need to be doing is a similar approach to the approach we took on commercial redevelopment. We need to be zoning and packaging areas with consent
not
to
being
allow...
government, though, we being the local people.
But I think a partnership with government, consultation with local people, where clearly there's a need for housing, I think this can be done. But we need... The problem is speed. I mean, some of these developments take years to come on for various blockages within the system. So we've got to deal with that as well.
Yes, but I mean, Conservative governments have been in place since 2010. Why hasn't it been dealt with?
Well, we tried localism. And
they could start with hospitals. They only have to build 40 of those.
That was the promise from Boris Johnson.
We could, but hold on, there's a lot going on there, which we can't go into. But look, on the government, we went down the localism agenda when we were in coalition with the Liberal Democrats, and I supported that. I think one of the problems with that is that it didn't then allow for that need for speed, and we have seen hold up after hold up. We know where the problems are in the system, Joe. The question is whether, but you had 13 years before, and it wasn't.
I accept everything's Labour's fault.
So let's forget about that. Let's actually look at what people need.
All right.
And it isn't just about housing. It is also about the fact in this country that the only way that people see themselves as being able to make a long-term investment is to buy a house.
Yes.
And that's
we're going to come on to
issue
renting in a moment. Can I just come back? I mean, you eventually, Sarah, said you do support mandatory house building targets, which Labour wants to introduce. On the Green Belt, you said no building on the Green Belt, but Keir Starmer did really quite strongly imply on the BBC that is what he would like to do. He clarified it, I think, again, I'm paraphrasing, that it wouldn't mean building over the countryside, but he did want to look at the Green Belt.
He also came up with this phrase of soft Green Belt, which I've never heard of before. I don't know what soft Green Belt is. I think what it means is that technically the Green Belt only exists around London, Nottingham and Bristol, I think. It's actually a technical term in law. Yeah. But let's look at the... But he wants to break the taboo, as he called it. So the green fields that makes me very nervous,
apron around
because that's the cheapest, quickest way for housing builders to get on the ground and make the most money.
We've done that for years in Swindon. We build like an onion. It doesn't work. You create problems by doing that, and I think he's made a mistake.
I agree.
What do you think, listening to these two on the issue of housing, bearing in mind Keir Starmer particularly has come up with these, well, I suppose, quite bold plans?
Yeah, I think the confusion, and I hope you don't mind me calling it slight confusion over the issue of whether or not this is Labour policy, suggests just how difficult it is to announce plans like this as a party leader, whether you're in opposition or whether you're in government, because realistically, if you're going to build with the speed that Robert says is necessary, which I agree with you is necessary, the amount of housing that we need in this country, you are going to upset some people. Even if you bring local people into the consultation process, there is always going to be someone who loses out. And I think any leader who's announcing these plans needs to accept that. And it genuinely is one of those tough decisions that leaders need to take. And it sounds from the interviews that Keir Starmer's done this morning that it is genuinely what he'd like to do if he gets into government.
Right, it's what he'd like to do, but will he be able to enact it?
Yeah, but I think like is the key word, isn't it? Yeah. He'd like to do it. I remember when Boris Johnson promised us the most radical planning reform shake-up, and he had a majority in the region of 80, and yet it never came to pass. They had to abandon the plans because of MP opposition. So listening to the panel, listening to the fact there's already some concerns on the Labour side, and, you know, that's outside the studio too, you do start to think, well, are you actually going to be able to deliver that if there is a Labour government, even if, and we don't currently know, so for example, local elections, lots of people are suggesting Labour largest party but could need help. Now, the Liberal Democrats, are they going to help with this? The Liberal Democrats play quite an interesting game often.
Well, they're accused, aren't they, of doing saying one thing nationally. I mean, they're not here and doing another thing.
This is my fundamental problem with the politics we have in this country. Something like this will take 20 years, 30 years to actually do properly, and we tend to look in 5-year cycles, and we need to be more bold. So I get where he's coming from. We need to have that vision, but then we need to actually back it up.
Right, and do you agree with Anusha's point that actually perhaps party leaders, prime ministers, just have to accept they're going to make some people, a lot of people, very unhappy? But in order to build these houses...
You can't make an omelette without breaking eggs, and somebody's new home is somebody else's view spoiled. You know, we've had to deal with that balance every year in my constituency. Look, there are parts of this country that have ambition to build. We need to identify them, work with them, zone the appropriate areas, and get on with the job. And modern methods of construction, you know, we need to make sure the financial services industry provides mortgages to allow these types of houses to be built far more in a prevalent way, because you can build them in weeks rather than months. Right.
Well, someone else who's not very happy with the idea, and it's only been announced in the last, well, if not announced, talked about in the last few hours, is John McDonnell, the former Shadow Chancellor, Labour MP. The Greenbelt was championed, he said, by the London County Council under Herbert Morrison in 1930s, legislated for by the Attlee Labour government in the 1940s, and has been the fundamental basis of a battle to protect the environment in working-class urban constituencies like mine over decades. What do you make of that?
I mean, that's his opinion, and factually, I'm sure he's absolutely right, because he always is. But the reality is, we've got people in insecure housing. We've got people that want to have a home that is theirs long-term. We're not seeing, well, I mean, the price of mortgages is going through the roof. The price of renting is going through the roof. And I really want proper social housing, and we have to build it somewhere.
Right. I mean, Michael Gove, as I said in that headline at the beginning, Robert, said cutting migration would help with the housing crisis. He then goes on to say, but he still wants builders from abroad to come here to build those homes. Look,
migration and uncontrolled migration is a planning nightmare for government and local authorities. You know, school places, health service, housing.
You've got control. I think the government's always saying that it's got control.
Well, yes, we don't have free movement anymore. I mean, look, we've got to be honest about migration. We've got a demand, we've got a need for more agricultural workers. We've expanded the scheme yesterday, quite rightly. The Prime Minister announced that. We need care workers. You know, look, let's be honest. Let's not pretend that we want to shut the doors. Yes, you can tighten up.
So, what do you think of Suella Braverman as Home Secretary? Her whole stuff.
Look, why do we include students in the number? We just unnecessarily put a rod for our own backs. I think that we need to disaggregate that, have a proper debate about migration, and then stop lumping all these issues together in a way that is at best confusing and at worst frankly serving another agenda.
I mean, obviously criticism of the sort of ongoing battle within the Conservative Party and the government over this. Do you think there are lots of Tory MPs who agree with Michael Gove that cutting migration would solve or help solve the housing crisis?
I think there are lots of Tory MPs who definitely think it's a factor. But I think that the point is there's lots of different factors that you would need to address. And it is one where I think it's probably a bit easier to get support in some parts of the party than saying let's build a lot of houses on Greenbelt or areas which are going to directly upset their constituents.
Right. Well, let's have a look at this and go on to the Renters Reform Bill. You've mentioned, obviously, renting sort of philosophically as well as owning, and also affordability. But no fault evictions to be banned in reform of rental sector. I presume you welcome that, Sarah?
Yeah, but it's not actually true, is it? I mean, so I've sort of pulled it out. It's actually that. Let me find the language. What he's looking to do is if you have antisocial behaviour, you can be evicted within 2 weeks. He's not looking at putting any proper, meaningful rent review, rent caps in. Shelter have said that 1 in every 7 minutes is being evicted at the moment. The Tories came in with this policy in 2019. 1 in every 7 minutes, a person is getting evicted. I mean, I just don't see what this is actually going to do in reality.
Right, well, what is it going to do? I mean, is it actually going to make any difference at all, Robert?
Well, look, I think that it is actually a welcome reform. You know, we promised it in the manifesto. We need to get on with it.
A bit late, though, isn't it?
Well, look, we had a lot to do, let's face it. And we had to deal with COVID, where, you know, I was dealing with the possessions ban at that time because of the COVID issue. Look, I think, well, Sarah's saying it's not going far enough. There's a lot of landlords out there saying it's going far too far. I think that whilst I'm entirely in favour of the speeding up on antisocial behaviour and rent arrears, I think, you know, landlords should be able to revisit.
The definition's not tight enough.
Yeah,
One person's annoyance is another person having their radio
But Sarah,
on.
there's a problem here, because if we end up in a situation where, in effect, there are few people going to be prepared to rent their houses, or worse, they will charge more, because this is my worry about these changes, they could be inflationary. You're then into the realm of rent controls. I'm sorry, rent controls are a disaster. Rent controls were tried in the 1977 Rent Act, and what happened was that landlords had no resources
But people
to improve.
need stability. The cost of living is going through the roof. So to know at least one of your fixed costs is going to remain stable is really important.
What it leads to is slum accommodation.
But it doesn't, because the other thing that we have in Rotherham is selective licensing. And what the council is able to do is, when there's a bad landlord, they can go in and enact on that.
Yeah.
So give more powers to the local authority to actually tackle bad landlords, rather than having this blanket legislation that I just don't think is going to meet its objectives.
You and I do agree on a lot of these things, and we can have a reasonable debate about this. But
you are allowed to disagree.
My worry is that in this drive to more regulation, you're going to constrict the market, and it's going to cost more.
But Gove is driving the
renters.
regulation.
Yeah, but you can't have it
So
both
you're
ways.
disagreeing with
You're
him
either
now.
saying that, you know, this isn't strong enough, or it's too strong. I think he's getting the balance more or less right, but we're going to have to watch this very carefully, because if we try and then rectify this by rent controls, I think we're storing up disaster.
Is that what? So you support that idea? I mean, Sadiq Khan, Labour's Mayor of London, has been advocating. It's not something Keir Starmer has said he would be in favour of, but you are in favour of.
What I want is people to have some consistency in their finances. So, you know, a yearly rent review, absolutely fine, but for someone to double it within a week and use that as a reason to evict people, I mean, that's not fair. These are people's homes. What are they meant to do? Because what happens is they then become homeless, and then the local authority has to pick them up. And then where are they meant to go? And we're in this endless cycle. Something's got to be done.
Right. I mean, the headline is the no-fault eviction, and that is evicting tenants with no justification. The idea is to shake up the private rental sector, says the government, strengthening the right for landlords to repossess properties from antisocial tenants, as Sarah and Robert have been talking about. But is it that significant, this bill? Is it really going to change the landscape for people out there renting?
Well, I think renters and also the charities and organisations that represent their rights have been waiting for this measure for such a long time. It was announced under Theresa May in April 2019. 4 years we've been waiting for it. And, you know, just in 1 year, from 2021 to 2022, homelessness due to no-fault evictions went up 50%. So this really affects people's lives, and if it comes in, hopefully it will bring down some of that homelessness that is caused by people being kicked out of their houses with very little notice and no reason. But I agree with Sarah's concern that if landlords can still put up rents mid-term, that's sort of a de facto no-fault eviction in itself, because people can't afford the rent and they have to move out.
Right.
So there's not enough protections in this.
Right. I mean, there's already been some response from Lord David Frost, Katie, former Cabinet Minister, Brexit Minister, on this renters' bill. He describes it as a dangerous intrusion into private property. I mean, is that going to be... You're screwing up your face there. What do you say in response? And I'll come to Katie.
It's not really private property, because this is the only way some people can be housed. We've got this weird system where we've just got these amateur landlords who are in charge of housing so many renters in this country. When you're a renter, you have fewer consumer rights than you do when you hire a car in this country.
Katie?
Well, David Frost, of course, potentially a future Tory MP, at which point he could cause, I think, a greater headache on this issue for if there is a Tory government, may not be at that point. But I think on the question, I suppose, of the criticism within the Tory party. I mean, I think there's definitely those who worry that you make the market so unattractive to landlords that then you end up reducing rental supply, which if you look at some of the issues, and there are obviously different factors in all these countries, but, you know, if you look at the Republic of Ireland and the shortage there, you want to have the right balance. But I think generally speaking, there's probably a greater concern amongst MPs that they're not doing enough for those who are struggling, both housing and renters. This is a manifesto commitment that they need to deliver on, and something that I think they want to be talking about by the time of the next election.
Well, you'll have heard Rishi Sunak in the headlines there, because he's been the Prime Minister in Iceland for a European summit. He's been making the case for reforming the European Court of Human Rights and their power to block UK deportation flights. Let's just show you some of the headlines. The Daily Express: Prime Minister, you must let us deport illegal migrants. The next headline here in The Guardian: cool response in Iceland as Rishi Sunak urges Europe's leaders to back Rwanda plan. That is the plan for people arriving on small boats to be deported to Rwanda to have their asylum claims processed there. The Daily Telegraph: Prime Minister demands fair reform of the European Court. Katie, what exactly is the Prime Minister asking for?
So this all relates to Section 39, and if you think about the Rwanda flight, which the Rwanda flight that never took off in the end.
It costs a fortune.
Exactly. A court injunction under this is what stopped it from happening, and therefore Rishi Sunak is trying to seek reform of that that section, so as to have a system which means that I think if you're talking about whether we leave, it's about saying, actually, can we avoid doing that by reforming the institution instead of going all the way out? Because there will be MPs on the right of the party who are saying if you cannot show progress, and I actually don't think it's stopping the boats full stop, despite the fact that is what he says in the 5 priorities. I think Rishi Sunak needs to show that he's getting somewhere towards that pledge ahead of the next election.
Right.
So if the flights aren't going, if the illegal migration bill does not have the impact it's meant to have, that's when the calls from the right of the party will grow to say we need to leave, ultimately, this European Court.
Right. Well, on that, I mean, Rob, what does he actually mean, Rishi Sunak, when he says he's going to reform the court? I mean, this is something that the court has enacted and is within its realm to do so. How can you reform it without leaving the European Convention on Human Rights?
No, you can. And
How?
The Conservative government back in 2010 did this in the Brighton Declaration, where Ken Clarke was Lord Chancellor, bringing together all ministers in the Council of Europe and reforming. Do you remember the backlogs in the European Court? Huge backlog. They reformed the system and dealt with the backlog. So the Prime Minister, no, hold on, the Prime Minister is actually doing absolutely the right thing by taking this to heads of government in the Council of Europe.
Yes, because they haven't met very often.
Exactly. It's been about 4 times, I think, since
it was created.
So this is a very significant moment, I think, for me personally. I think it's a good message that we're sending to our friends in the Council of Europe that we're serious about improving the processes. Katie's right about Rule 39. We think that there should be more of an opportunity for the UK to make representations, to say why there wasn't serious and irrevocable harm to be caused, because you could fly them back from Rwanda to begin with. I mean, the argument, I thought it was an odd decision. So the Prime Minister, I think, is right to go in there in all sincerity and seek to improve the processes. And I think, in the past we've shown we can do this. Can I say this? The number of times the UK have been found in breach of the Convention. Do you know last year? Do you know how many times? Twice.
Right.
Russia, you're looking at over 300
I mean, we can always do the sort of comparison, but on this particular issue, can the Rwanda... you have to ask the European Court.
Yeah.
But, I mean, can the Rwanda plan actually work while the UK is still part of the European Convention of Human Rights and then is under the jurisdiction of the European Court?
Look, the final issue has not been ruled upon.
The answer is no.
No, I disagree with that. I absolutely disagree with that. You've got other members of the Council of Europe, like Denmark, who have been exploring this option. The idea that somehow we're some pariah is not right.
Right. Well, I haven't said that. I'm just asking you whether it could work in that way.
The parliamentary president of the Council of Europe has said if we go down this route, we will become the next Russia. I mean, that's quite clear. And the whole illegal immigrant... That's what he said.
Well, that's his opinion.
Well, he's kind of the president of it, so it's quite a strong opinion to have. And it's not something that I take any pride in, my country being seen as a pariah like that. The whole bill doesn't work. And what Rishi's trying to do is what Cameron did before Brexit. He's flailing around, trying to negotiate a deal to keep the more extreme and your party happy. And he's just looking to blame people. So he can't blame Brexit. For once, he can't blame Labour. So he's now trying to blame the European Court. What he actually needs to do is have a proper, workable plan for this. That's the one thing that is in his control and would make the difference.
Robert?
I think the Prime Minister, in all of his actions, has actually shown a huge amount of maturity. You know, the deal he's been doing with Albania, the fact that he's opening up safe and legal routes.
Perks.
Yeah, hold on, Sarah. Look, I think your characterisation is absolutely wrong, I'm afraid. The Prime Minister is showing responsibility. You know, he could have said, well, no point me going to Reykjavik, I'm not going to get anything. It's clear that he wants to engage positively, and dialogue has worked in the past. This isn't the EU. This isn't the EU court whose rulings are automatically binding irrespective. This is a court that in the past, through dialogue, has actually listened, learned and adapted, which is why there are so few cases involving the UK.
So would it have been better if he had this conversation before bringing the bill forwards? That's the mature
well, there
thing
was
to do.
No, to be fair to Dominic Raab, and I've been critic of him on the Bill of Rights, he actually did open up a dialogue with the Council of Europe. So the government has got a track record on this for many months now, and I think it should be commended for it.
Anush, can the government stop the boats and enact their Rwanda policy while the UK remains in the European Convention on Human Rights?
Well, I don't think it can, but I also don't think if Rishi Sunak went and got everything he wanted that we've just been discussing, I still don't think it would stop the boats as he would like. Because, you know, the issue is that he is asking for this change to stop, to be able to do deportation flights of people who come over the Channel route. But that relies on the assumption that deportation flights will stop people, will put people off taking that journey. Will it put people off? There's not really any evidence for that. You know, there's been tougher and tougher lines and also legislation on asylum in the UK over the years. It hasn't really stopped people taking that dangerous journey because they are so desperate to come to the UK. So I don't think it would work either way.
Robert?
Well, I think the other part of his approach at Reykjavik has been to talk about collective responsibility, collective action. And he's bang on right about that. You know, unless the whole of Europe and all its member states come together and have a quota system where we all take our share of responsibility, pro rata on population, that's the way we do it, then we can actually deal with this problem in a mature way. You know, we've got Britain blaming France, we've got France blaming Italy, Italy blaming Greece. Let's stop pointing fingers and actually take responsibility.
Sarah, on what Keir Starmer and the Labour Party are suggesting, they don't back, you don't back the Rwanda plan or the illegal migration bill that goes somewhat further, including this bid to reform the European Court on Human Rights. What would Labour do? I know what they would do in terms of sort of process, dealing with the backlog and sort of long-term plans. But is there a way of stopping this business, this people smuggling business?
And that's exactly what it is.
Right, yeah. I mean, is there a plan on the Labour side to stop that? You certainly don't think Rwanda will work. What would Labour's...
Well, there's two things. So I chair the International Development Select Committee, and we did an inquiry into why the Home Office is spending so much foreign aid on housing refugees here rather than dealing with the root causes. So the first thing is we have always been brilliant on development. So stabilising fragile states, creating a strong civil society, creating reasons for people to feel safe in their homes so that they don't have to flee, whether that's an economic driver or persecution. So that's one thing, go back to that. The other thing is take the money out of the situation of crossing the Channel. So what we're seeing is there are people making a lot of money, people traffickers, either sort of recruiting in Albania and promising them everything, or desperate people who will pay anything to get over here. So the only way I can see of doing that is by having a safe passage. It's having a properly resourced border control. It's having a proper asylum system so that we can actually process people swiftly and either return them home if they have no legal right to be here, or fast-track them through an asylum system so that they can become tax-paying, registered citizens, whereas at the moment we've just got people, we don't know who they are, we don't know where they are, and we've got no way of controlling that.
Well, that sounds like a pretty comprehensive plan. What's wrong with that?
But I agree with a lot of what Sarah said, and I supported increasing the right of asylum seekers to work here because, frankly, a lot of them are disappearing into irregular work, being paid very poorly on construction sites and in the restaurant industry. But Sarah's point about safe and legal, you know, Tim Lawton, me and a few others really pushed to make sure that in this bill we got a guarantee from the government or in statute that plans be made for safe and legal routes with limits. That actually does two things. One, it shows that we're a responsible government and we're doing everything we can to protect people who are fleeing persecution. But secondly, it makes it easier to say that if you're coming over here on a boat, whether you're smuggled or trafficked, that's unlawful, that's illegal. There's a safe and legal route open to you, perhaps applying online at an embassy or a high commission, which can be done out of country in a way that is safe.
Right, well, we're going to talk about Sudan in just a moment, but Katie, I think the figures are 7,000 people this year so far have crossed the channel in those small boats. I mean, no progress is being made by this government, is it?
I think of all the 5 pledges, it was very much seen as the hardest. I spoke to ministers who say very brave of the Prime Minister, which tends to mean that they don't think it was perhaps the smartest thing tactically to put in because it's so hard to meet. I think the problem for Rishi Sunak is actually a lot of those pledges are also now looking hard, which are supposed to be the easy ones. But therefore, I think to look at it, ultimately, there is not one single policy that's going to stop the boats. It's lots of different measures coming together. And then there's the question of whether the deterrent effect does do what it says. And we're not going to really know until the scheme gets up and running. But the question is, will the scheme get up and running this side of the election? We're waiting on an appeal in terms of a court case. So I still think there's a chance that there could be a moment between now and the election which at least changes the mood music in terms of Rishi Sunak's plans to stop it. But he does need that because right now it's looking very, very difficult. And I think around him, some ministers are quite pessimistic.
Right, we've got Prime Minister's questions with the deputies in 10 minutes' time. You've mentioned safe and legal routes, both of you. As chair of the International Development Committee, Sarah, do you want to see a specific safe and legal route from Sudan?
I would say yes. I mean, what's happening there is horrific. It was preventable. We turned a blind eye for a very long time. In some ways, you could argue that we colluded by not intervening and putting stronger sanctions around the generals. This was an inevitability. What's happening now is horrific. It is going to most likely scale into other countries. And unless we do something, I mean, I've had so many Sudanese NHS doctors who are either trapped out there or have got family trapped out there.
Well, and we can see pictures here of factions in Sudan fighting in Khartoum, and you can see already here, I mean, a refugee crisis is unfolding, or has unfolded.
I mean, the problem that I've got is, though, we saw what happened in Afghanistan, we saw what happened in Ukraine. There still doesn't seem to be a safe passage plan in place.
Right, you are in favour of it. Should there be a plan in place right now from Sudan?
I think there should be, and I think other countries in Europe should also be doing likewise.
Right. Let's move on, because, as I say, we've got Prime Minister's questions coming up shortly. And talk about this in the Independent headline. Voter ID is gerrymandering, which backfired on Tories, says Jacob Rees-Mogg, rather surprisingly. It goes on to say elderly Tory voters didn't have ID for local elections, says ex-Cabinet Minister. Yes, Jacob Rees-Mogg has accused his own government of fixing voting rules to try and gain an advantage in those local elections, with the introduction, as you remember, quite controversially, of voter ID for the first time. But he said it made it harder for Conservative voters in many cases. Let's have a listen to what he said.
Parties that try and gerrymander end up finding that their clever scheme comes back to bite them, as, dare I say, we found by insisting on voter ID for elections. And we found that the people who didn't have ID were elderly, and they by and large voted Conservative. So we made it hard for our own voters, and we upset a system that worked perfectly well. It was one of the glories of our country, actually, that we did on an honesty basis, when the real problem is with postal voting. So don't get too fretful about random schemes brought up by the socialists, because gerrymandering doesn't really work.
So that was Jacob Rees-Mogg earlier this week, in fact, at the National Conservatism Conference. Astonishing, admitting that in his mind, the government fixed the rules, or tried to.
Listening carefully, he was responding to a point about votes at 16 and allowing EU citizens to vote. He's making the point.
He talked about voter ID and the opening thing. He's talking very clear about gerrymandering because you thought it might actually harm Labour voters.
Well, I disagree. I mean, he used an example of voter ID in the context of a question about a Labour policy.
We'll come on to the Labour policy
in a minute. A lot of us are rather sceptical about. But I'll say this. Look, my own experience of voter ID, we've just had it, we have elections every year. No, I don't agree. I don't think it did make any difference to either the way people voted. There were very few examples of people who were turned
So
away.
why do we need the legislation?
But no, but other countries in Europe do this. I mean, you know, we keep on saying, well, I'm sorry, Sarah, they do.
No, I'm
mature
not.
democracies in Europe have ID. It's always surprised me, to say the least, that I can just bowl up at a polling station and say I'm John Doe and then get a ballot paper. I think having this is a proper safeguard. There's plenty of ways in which you can identify yourself. It's been tested to destruction. I think it's a very sensible reform, and I was happy to support it in government.
Yes, but I think it's, and that's fine, you and many other Conservative MPs, but what's interesting and somewhat astonishing is that Jacob Rees-Mogg thinks the motivation for it was to fix it.
We always wondered why this was coming through, because there wasn't big cases of voter fraud. And now he's told us why. He was in Cabinet. Now I get it.
That's his view. I don't agree.
He's wrong.
Well, yes, he is wrong. That wasn't the motivation.
Right.
But it's also not a joke. You know, it's not funny. This is about our democracy. And I hear what you're saying about Europe, but actually we did have a robust system. And then he throws in this curveball of, oh, it's about postal voting. What? Where has that come from? Where's the evidence for that? It's a dangerous game he's playing.
Right, well, let's get some reaction. First of all, just go into the chamber as they're preparing for Prime Minister's questions in 5 minutes' time. What have you made of this intervention from Jacob Rees-Mogg?
Well, it is quite shocking because he was a member of that government that was in favour of bringing these ID rules in. I think the point that he's making is actually quite interesting, which is if you do try and stitch up the rules, either the voting system or the voting process, it doesn't always work in the favour of the party that you'd assume it would work in. So, you know, the Conservatives brought back first past the post in mayoral elections, for example. Yeah. We now have a Middlesbrough mayor. We think that might have been because of that change. So, you know, it doesn't always help the party who's making those changes. But, you know, it does vindicate some of us who were saying, what was the reason for this policy? It seemed like a solution in search of a problem, because we don't really have voter fraud in this country.
Right, and I just want to say we'll be catching up with Lauren Tavriga from the BBC's Political Research Unit. There she is. She'll be listening out for any dubious claims and statistics at Prime Minister's questions, possibly on this subject. Katie, what was your response?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there are some Tories, and we just heard from one who thought that it would benefit them in terms of the rule. I don't know if it was the defining reason for the government choosing it, but there was certainly a conception, an idea that if it was going to hurt anyone, it would be younger voters who tend to be more likely to vote Labour or, you know, parties to the left of Labour. And therefore, it does raise questions about whether this is actually, you know, going to be a big thing in the future. But I think speaking to, you know, Labour and Tory and councillors, I don't think anyone thinks voter ID was decisive in terms of those local election results.
No, there were some figures of people being turned away. Many of them came back. But I suppose there were some...
factors some people thought it might be, I think.
No, absolutely. I mean, Sadiq Khan, the London mayor, Labour's London mayor, has said Labour should repeal, I should say, the policy. Would you be in favour of that?
I don't see what it achieves. And what I saw on polling day was people turning up, being told that they had to come back with voter ID. And I don't know if they did or not. I mean, democracy is precious.
A proportion of people did. I mean, from the few figures
I'm sure that they did. But if it turns anyone away...
You have to be quite committed to vote in local elections anyway, I suppose.
It cuts both ways. Labour was saying it was going to be Armageddon and nobody was going to vote. They were wrong.
Yes, that's
Katie's
true.
point is right. It didn't actually affect.
Well, let's talk about and pick up the other part of what Jacob Rees-Mogg, in fact, was responding to, what he called, I think, a socialist proposal. And that's Labour considering extending voting rights to some EU citizens living in the UK if the party wins the next general election. Let's have a listen.
Let's just take someone who's been here for 30 years, has literally put down their roots here, as I say, married to a Brit, their kids are here. This is their country, this is where they live, this is where they contribute. I think it's very hard to say, well, you should really be voting back in your country of origin where you haven't been living for 30 years. That actually just doesn't pass the common sense test for me.
Few minutes, as I say, to Prime Minister's questions. The chamber is filling up. Sarah, is Labour planning to make this a policy?
I don't know.
Should they?
This is part of our process. I mean, the argument that Keir puts forward is quite a persuasive one. I've not thought through all the consequences, to be honest, and that's why we have our National Policy Forum, that's why we have conference, to throw those all up in the air. So, but there's logic to it.
There is a logic, but I suppose there's also a logic to saying why not to all immigrants or...
I think if you are sort of working here, if you are paying your taxes here,
Yes, I mean, but special status to EU, perhaps that leans into what Jacob Rees-Mogg is saying about parties trying to...
I'm sure you're following the line that he wants you to.
No, I mean, it just is...
I don't know. There's a way to get the vote, is to get UK citizenship, and then it's not discriminatory in favour of people from one part of the world or not. And, there's a wider point here about changing the eligibility to vote down to 16. I personally think we should have referendum locks on any major constitutional change of that nature, and we should all decide whether or not the franchise is going to change.
And what do you think? Should it?
Over the years, my mind, I've debated a lot and discussed a lot with youngsters.
And it's mellowed in favour of 16?
Mellowed more in favour, actually,
16.
but I think we should all have a say in deciding.
I mean, is there a logic to allowing EU citizens who've been here for 20, 30 years to have a vote in general elections?
Yes, definitely. I mean, they're affected by the policies that the government that comes in that election enacts. So I think it's only just that they should get a say in that. But like you say, there are other immigrants who have been here for a very long time. It takes a long time to get UK citizenship. You can live here forever without it, really.
And is it expensive? It's quite expensive, isn't it? To
about £7,000, I think.
Oh, right, it's even more expensive than I thought. Katie?
Yeah, and I think one thing is, well, is it reciprocal in the sense, would a British national living in one of the countries that you allow us be able to?
Yeah, do you revoke it in one country to take it in the other? Yeah, I mean, there's lots of things to work through.
I think things like that need to be thought through on this, because those are some of the criticisms you're going to hear if Labour try and pushes through without having a referendum.
Right, Alistair Jack, Scottish Secretary there at Scotland Secretary at the Dispatch Box. Oliver Dowden up against Angela Rayner. What do you think for the first time?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting because Oliver Dowden, in his previous roles, has often helped Tory Prime Ministers prepare for PMQs.
One thing to prepare them, one thing
exactly.
to do.
So can he channel that? Will it rub off on him? Because they are quite different personalities.
Gossip is that he's very nervous.
I think he's very nervous. Sarah says the gossip is he's very nervous.
Yeah, I think Oliver Dowden and Angela Rayner, you wouldn't imagine them as a classic pair on a night out, but maybe they'll have more in there.
Should be good telly, though.
Anoush. Well, I was going to miss Angela Rayner and Dominic Raab's clashes because there genuinely seemed to be some proper hostility between them when they came up against the ballot box. Very different from Keir Starmer versus Rishi Sunak, who have quite a similar, more conciliatory style.
Right. I think we can go into the chamber for PMQs.
Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I have been asked to reply on behalf of my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister. He is currently travelling to Japan to attend the G7 summit. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that colleagues from across the House will join me in congratulating Liverpool for its wonderful staging of the Eurovision Song Contest on behalf of Ukraine. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
The Royal Lancaster Infirmary is a 130-year-old crumbling hospital and was meant to be one of the government's 40 new hospitals. However, the funding announcement has been delayed 4 times already, so can the Deputy Prime Minister reassure my constituents that this is not going to be another broken Tory promise?
I can absolutely assure the Honourable Lady that we remain fully committed to those 40 hospitals from our manifesto, and indeed we have already provided £3.9 billion worth of initial capital.
Craig McKinley. Mr. Speaker, I have a very serious matter affecting every constituency to bring to my right honourable friend's attention. Amazon have been facilitating the sale of counterfeit postage stamps from China, virtually perfect except for the barcode. I've contacted the NCA, the National Trading Standards, and I'm afraid I've received woeful responses. I've now sent my concerns to the Serious Fraud Office and the Economic Crime Unit of the City of London Police. Amazon are patently facilitating remittances of illegal gotten cash, and I believe this is in contravention of the Forgery and Counterfeiting Act 1981. Can my right honourable friend assist me in taking this further?
Well, Mr. Speaker, may I pay tribute to my honourable friend? I know how hard he has been campaigning on this important issue. The Home Secretary will have heard his remarks. I would say that the Digital Markets and Competition and Consumer Bill does put duties on those platforms, and ultimately, if fraud is being perpetrated, the police should take action.
We now come to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and it's a pleasure to welcome yet another Deputy Prime Minister to the dispatch box, the third deputy that I've faced in 3 years. And you know what they say, the third time's a charm. And I'm also pleased to note, Mr Speaker, that the Prime Minister has a working-class friend, finally. I seem to remember that after the loss of 300 Conservative seats at last year's local elections, the right honourable gentleman resigned, saying someone must take responsibility. After 1,000 more Conservative councillors had been given the boot by voters, who does he think is responsible now?
Well, Mr Speaker, in the spirit of the Right Honourable Lady's opening remarks, can I just say it really is a pleasure to see the Right Honourable Lady here today. I was, though, expecting to face the Labour leader's choice for the next Deputy Prime Minister if they win the election, so I'm surprised that the Lib Dem leader isn't taking questions today. Mr Speaker, you will forgive me, Mr Speaker, you will forgive me if I take the Right Honourable Lady's predictions with a pinch of salt. After all, she confidently predicted that the Right Honourable Member for Islington North would one day be Prime Minister. Remember, this is a man who wanted to abolish the army, scrap Trident, withdraw from NATO and abandon Ukraine. And what did she say to that? She couldn't wait for him to be Prime Minister.
Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, it's absolutely amazing that while the Labour Party is preparing to govern with a Labour majority, his party is starting to prepare for opposition, Mr Speaker. And this week, at the National Conservative Conference, a member for Devisers blamed the country's problems on a new religion. He even hit out at the dystopian fantasy of John Lennon. The member for Pentonstone and Stockbridge said identifying falling birthing rates is the overarching threat to the UK. She criticised woke teaching for destroying children's souls and causing self-harm and suicide among people. And the Right Honourable Member for North East Somerset really let the cat out the bag when he said parties that try to gerrymander end up finding their clever schemes come back to bite them, as dare I said we found when insisting on voter ID. The Right Honourable gentleman opposite, while working in Number 10, said he had to listen to the radio every morning to find out what was really going on in the country. Apparently, he was surprised on a daily basis by what he learned. And most of his time was spent on day-to-day crisis management. 11 years on, Mr Speaker, nothing has changed.
Deputy Prime Minister.
I'm not quite sure what the question was there, Mr Speaker. But if she wants to talk about this sort of thing, we all know what's going on with her and her leader. It's all lovey-dovey on the surface. They turn it on for the cameras, but as soon as they're off, it's a different story. They're at each other's throats. Mr Speaker, they're the Phil and Holly of British politics.
Deputy Leader.
Mr Speaker.
Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The reality is, after 13 years of Tory rule, they're still lurching from crisis to crisis and wallowing in their own mess. They can't solve the crisis because they are the crisis. The honourable member opposite should take more note of what's happening at his conferences in his party before trying to make up what's happening in mine. The Prime Minister pledged that by March, NHS waiting lists would fall. It's now May. So can he tell us, since he made that pledge, is the number of people waiting on late waiting lists higher or lower?
Mr Speaker, we are making good progress, for example, with two-year waiting lists. But the Right Honourable Lady seems to forget a crucial fact. The United Kingdom experienced an unprecedented pandemic. Right before COVID, GP satisfaction was high. Delayed discharges were half. ambulance targets were being met. And she knows that right now, in Labour-run Wales, exactly the same challenges are being faced. The difference between us is, on this side of the House, we've got a plan to fix it, while she's too busy playing petty politics.
Mr. Speaker, even before the pandemic, waiting lists were going up. So it doesn't wash that this government, after 13 years in power, is blaming everybody but themselves for what people are having to put up with. He appears to be claiming that 11,000 patients waiting more than 18 months is an achievement. The last Labour government reduced waiting times from 18 months to 18 weeks, and he can come back to me when he's achieved that. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, waiting lists are longer than when the Prime Minister made his pledge 5 months ago. The number of people in England waiting to start hospital treatment is the highest since records began. 7.3 million patients left waiting. Now, I know the Prime Minister has his own private GP, so maybe he doesn't appreciate the urgency. But he's left people like my constituent Carol waiting for over a year for an urgent appointment, moved from waiting list to waiting list with appointments cancelled again and again. So if not now, when will waiting lists fall?
Order. It'll continue till I hear the end of this question. If I get any more interruptions, it will take longer. Angela Ray.
Mr. Speaker, they don't want to hear the question because they know the answer. They know the answer is that they failed the British people. So when will waiting lists fall?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I would gently say to the Right Honourable Lady, that if she cares that much about access to our healthcare, why is she opposing our minimum service levels? They will provide core emergency services with vital cover during healthcare strikes. Does she not think that vulnerable patients deserve that level of care, or is she too weak to stand up to her union paymasters?
Mr. Speaker, we all want minimum service levels. It's this government. It's this government that have failed to provide minimum service levels in all of our trains, in all of our public services, because they've run them down and mismanaged them for the last 13 years. Now, it's not just waiting times, Mr. Speaker. 13 years after the Landmark Marmot review into child poverty, Sir Michael says this government is on track to make child poverty worse, with more than a quarter of our children living in poverty last year. When I was a young mum, I remember the sick feeling in my stomach not knowing if my wages would cover the bills. Yet his government has taken a wrecking ball to measures by the last Labour government to eradicate child poverty, even abolishing the child poverty unit. They tried to justify this by saying they no longer needed a child poverty unit because they've abolished the child poverty targets. So can he tell us what level of poverty he considers to be a success?
I'd say to the Right Honourable Lady, this comprehensive schoolboy is not going to take any lectures from the party opposite about the lives of working people. What I would say is that we have introduced record increases in the national living wage, something that this party introduced, the party opposite failed to do so. And we have taken 1 million working-age people out of poverty altogether. That is the record of my party, and one of which I am very proud.
Mr. Speaker, the last Labour government made it their mission to reduce the number of children in poverty by 1 million. We achieved that. Under the Tories, child poverty is nearly back to the level it was when Labour last inherited the Tory mess. After 13 years of the Tories, they're stuck in a conveyor belt of crisis. And while his party is preparing for opposition with their Trump Tribute Act conference over the road, Labour are focused on fixing the real problems facing British people. The Tories have picked their side. They're for the vested interests, for the oil companies and the bankers, for those that are profiting from the crisis and not suffering from it. Whether it's failing the millions of people anxiously waiting for treatment or overseeing a rise in child poverty. And while his colleagues spout nonsense at their carnival of conspiracy, I want to know, when will his party stop blaming everybody else and realise that the problem is them?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I will proudly defend our record in office. Crime down 50%, near record levels of employment, a record minimum wage. And what, Mr. Speaker, what's their record? 4 general election defeats, 30 promises already broken, and 1 leader who let anti-Semitism run wild. That is why the British people will never trust the Labour Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend please send his condolences to the family of Hilton Ward councillor Gillian Lemon, who at the young age of 52 tragically died partway through the election count on Friday. This means that the whole election for all 3 councillors has had to be voided, even though the returning officer was ready to declare 3 Conservative councillors for the Hilton Ward. Perhaps following this dreadful experience, my right honourable friend will confirm that the best way to thank Councillor Gillian Lemon for her service is for the good people of Hilton Ward in South Derbyshire to vote again 3 times for the 3 Conservative candidates on Thursday the 15th of June.
Well, Mr. Speaker, may I extend my deepest sympathies on behalf of these benches and the Conservative Party to Councillor Gillian Lemon's family. We all know how incredibly hard local councillors work, and she was a strong representative of South Derbyshire. And like my honourable friend, I do hope that the people of Hilton Ward will reflect on this by voting for Conservative candidates at the forthcoming election.
We now come to the Deputy Leader of the SNP, Murray Black.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2016, the Deputy Prime Minister told his constituents in a blog that it was his duty to, and I quote, furnish them with all the facts that are available with regards to Brexit. Today, Brexit Britain faces higher food prices, a lack of workers, a shrinking economy and a decline in living standards. Why is he happy to ignore those facts?
The Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have one of the fastest growth rates in the whole of the G7 since Brexit. And we all know, and in fairness, we all know the policy of the SNP. And they said it this weekend, I quote, we need to undo Brexit. But let me tell you, if I were them, I'd start by undoing the mess they've left Scotland in and start working with the United Kingdom government and focus on the priorities of the Scottish people, not the priorities of their party.
Murray Black.
Check the data. Mr. Speaker, the only thing more deluded than that defence of Brexit is the Labour Party's support of it. Now, just today, the world's 4th largest car manufacturer said that Brexit was, and again I quote, a threat to our export business and the sustainability of our UK manufacturing options. Even Nigel Farage can admit that Brexit has failed. So, Mr. Speaker, why can't he?
Deputy Prime Minister.
I would say to the Honourable Lady, one of the best ways of getting behind industry in this country is get behind the trade deals we're striking with many countries around the world, which they have singularly failed to oppose. And I see last week the SNP promised to build a new Scotland. I don't know whether she's aware, but the SNP have been in power for 13 years. Perhaps they should stop their focus on independence and focus on the priorities of the Scottish people.
Esther McVey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituency has a problem with travellers. My constituency has a problem with travellers pitching on private land and common land and causing a nuisance currently on Parkgate Industrial Estate in Knutsford. Either the police don't have sufficient powers to deal with this issue, or they do have sufficient powers but they're not using them. So will the Deputy Prime Minister get the government to speak with Cheshire Police to ensure that they do have the powers to deal with this plight on our local community and that they use them?
Well, the Right Honourable Lady, my right honourable friend, is absolutely right to highlight the misery caused by unauthorised encampments. I've seen this in my own constituency as well. I understand that Home Office officials do regularly liaise with the National Police Chiefs Council on this, but of course my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, will have heard my right honourable friend's representations, and I trust she will act on those.
Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Mr Speaker, the Deputy Prime Minister will be aware of the ongoing concerns of unionists in Northern Ireland about our ability to trade freely within the United Kingdom and its internal market, given the continued application of EU law on the manufacture of all goods in Northern Ireland. We now have proposals for a future border operating model that could potentially create further barriers to trade between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. Will the Deputy Prime Minister give me an assurance that the Government will, in law, protect Northern Ireland's ability to trade freely within and with the rest of the United Kingdom?
Yes, well, I would like to say that we've already shown a willingness to legislate to protect Northern Ireland's place within the Union, and we're committed to providing exactly the protections that the Right Honourable Gentleman refers to around Northern Ireland's unfettered access to the whole United Kingdom market. So I can give those assurances, and of course we stand ready to work with the Right Honourable Gentleman and representatives across unionism to reflect the further steps required to strengthen our precious union.
Angela Richardson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Throughout the early hours of Saturday morning, I was out with Kathy, Peter, Joe and Tim, who volunteer as Guildford Street Angels. I pay tribute to them and all the volunteers who are out every weekend and in all weathers. But, Mr Speaker, it's an absolute disgrace that the Liberal Democrat-run council shut the public loos. At night, there are no single-sex spaces for our young women, and they are seeking out dark, secluded areas of their court short, which is dangerous. They are at increased risk of sexual assault. Will my right honourable friend join me in calling for the immediate reopening of the town centre loos in Guildford?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for raising this very important issue, and sadly, I'm afraid that's what one might expect from a Lib Dem-run council. I do join her in thanking the Guildford Street Angels for all of their efforts, and I'm sure that they and she will continue to make those views known to Guildford Borough Council.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Many of my constituents are struggling to pay the bills and put food on the table. Food prices have risen by over 19% in the last year, with the cheapest infant formula up 45%, gas prices up 129%, electricity up 67%. Many report borrowing more money than this time last year, with car manufacturers threatening to move production. The OBR saying 100 billion has been lost from the economy forever, and wages falling further and further behind basic living expenses. So does he really still believe his government's kamikaze Brexit is delivering for the people of these isles?
Deputy Prime Minister.
I certainly do believe that, Mr Speaker, and I would say to the members on those benches that it's only because of the strength of our United Kingdom that we're able to afford the sort of interventions, for example, that we've had with the cost of living, with over £3,300 for every single family in our United Kingdom, paid for by a 75% windfall tax on oil and gas companies. That's the United Kingdom delivering on the cost of living.
Daniel Kaczynski.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In 2016, we secured over £300 million for the modernisation of A&E services in Shropshire. 6 years on, that money has still not been spent, and construction hasn't started. I have a real concern about the quality of managers within our local NHS trust, that this decision has not been taken. What can my right honourable friend do to help us in Shropshire to ensure that finally this £312 million is spent and that A&E services are modernised, because there is nothing more important than the safety of constituents when they go into A&E services?
Deputy Prime Minister.
I pay tribute to my honourable friend for raising this issue. I know that his constituents are anxious for building work to get underway as soon as possible. And I know that the Department for Health are working closely with NHS England and the Trust to support the development of the scheme. And the Trust is due to submit plans to the Department for Health in the coming months, and the Department will work at pace to review those plans.
Marshall de Cordova.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Leaseholders in Battersea are trapped in an outdated and unfair leasehold system. The Secretary of State said, and I quote, "The government would absolutely maintain a commitment to abolish the leasehold system and would bring forward legislation shortly." But we now know that this is no longer the case. So, Deputy Prime Minister, why has the government yet again done a never U-turn and yet again broken a never promise to leaseholders to scrap its plans to end the outdated leaseholder system?
Well, I'd like to reassure the Honourable Lady and members of this House that the government is committed to reforming the leaseholder system to give homeowners greater control and give cheaper access to leaseholder renewal, including a 990-year extension with zero financial ground rent. And we will set out plans for further reforms later in this Parliament.
Sir Desmond Sway.
What would be a reason for extending the general election franchise to settled EU citizens, a population of voters equal to the number in Wales?
Well, I think my honourable friend is referring to the plans from the party opposite. And it's actually quite interesting that this week, while we're pushing ahead with legislation to break the smuggling gangs, what's Labour's big idea? Give foreign nationals a say in our elections. So there we have it. While the Conservatives will stop the boats, Labour will rig the votes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was concerned to read last week that the Prime Minister had to be airlifted to a pharmacy in Southampton after suffering electoral dysfunction. Several weeks earlier, he flew all the way from Lancashire to Yorkshire by private jet. Meanwhile, angry rail commuters face the reality of cancellations, longer journey times, and are unable to get to work on time as operators shed services. The public think that the Prime Minister's got his head in the clouds. They're right, aren't they?
It is quite extraordinary, Mr. Speaker, to take lectures from the party opposite about the railways when actually the head of the train drivers' union actually sits on Labour's NEC. And indeed, she was described by the Right Honourable Lady, the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, as, quote, one of us. No wonder Labour won't stand up to the militant rail unions. They literally let them drive their policies.
Mr. Speaker, incredible regeneration work is taking place on Teesside, led by our Mayor, Ben Houchin. Sadly, we have seen a shameful attempt to smear the amazing Teesworks project, led by the Honourable Member for Middlesbrough, who I've given advance notice to. Will he confirm that it was always an integral part of the business case that the private sector should co-invest alongside government and that the Teesworks arrangements themselves have been checked and approved by the government? And will he reconfirm his full support for the Teesworks projects, reassure investors and join me in calling for the Labour Party to apologise for talking down Teesside?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely correct to raise this issue. It is the UK's first free port, and it continues to attract billions of pounds of private sector investment, creating jobs and supporting the local economy. And I think the whole House will see through the inexcusable attempts by the Labour Party to talk down those successes on Teesside, where local leaders are working tirelessly to improve that region for the first time in a generation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2011, the first year that the Tories came into government, 61,000 people received emergency food parcels from food banks. In 2022-23, that figure had gone up to nearly 3 million. 1 million of them children. It's gone up every year that the Conservatives have been in power bar one. So, will he tell the House, is that a record that he proudly defends?
I'm very proud of the fact that this government has given record numbers of people the opportunity to have jobs and employment, which is the surest route out of poverty. And it is the case that I believe up to 3.6 million new jobs have been created under this government.
Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's truly excellent news to see England rising up the international league tables for reading to become the highest performing country in the Western world. That's testament to the hard work of our teachers and the dedication of our honourable friend for Bognor to follow evidence-based policy. But this progress will only be sustained if children are in school regularly, able to learn. So can I strongly commend to him and to the government the 10-minute rule bill presented by my honourable friend for Meon Valley. It has cross-party support, delivers on key recommendations of the Education Select Committee and the Children's Commissioner. The government should adopt it as soon as possible.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight those brilliant figures which show that we've now jumped to the 4th best in the whole world for reading. And I certainly see in schools it's much, much more demanding than it was in my day, and that's tribute to the ministerial team that have done such a fabulous job. I will, of course, examine the details of the 10-minute rule bill to which he refers.
Tommy Shepherd.
Mr. Speaker, it is an open secret that many in the Conservative Party would wish to roll back the democratic gains of devolution either in part or completely. The noble Lord Frost, former minister, the architect of the disastrous Brexit agreement and now, I believe, seeking a safe Tory seat in this chamber, recently let the cat out of the bag when he said the government should review and roll back some devolved powers.
Just try it.
Does the Deputy Prime Minister agree with him?
Hear, hear.
I would say to the honourable gentleman, the only thing that will destroy devolution is a vote for independence in Scotland, as advocated by those on those benches.
Matt Hancock.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And can I congratulate my right honourable friend on a brilliant first performance at Prime Minister's question. Will he keep the government laser-focused on the issues that matter to people like the cost of living in the NHS, and on the issues of the future, like artificial intelligence, which needs regulatory attention, and ignore the reactionary voices, no matter where they come from?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight this. I'm incredibly optimistic about the future of this country in industries across the piece, including digital or indeed film and television in my own constituency. We're genuinely world-leading, creating high-quality jobs that we want our children or grandchildren to have.
Sean Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Half the children in Newcastle Central are growing up in poverty. Shocking. Over the last 5 years, the delivery of food parcels to North East children has risen by 250%. The number of North East children who are homeless rose by 50% last year. On average, their parents' wages will have fallen by £1,000, and if any of this affects their mental health, they face a 5-month wait for treatment. Why is his government making it so hard for our kids?
Well, I really think this House needs a correction on the facts, given what's come from the party opposite. It is the case that because of our national living wage, defined as more than at least 2/3 of median income, that's at its lowest point for years, and we've actually lifted 1.7 million people out of absolute poverty altogether. That is the track record of this government.
Gillis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The people of Longport and Burslem, as well as Port Hill and my neighbouring constituency neighbour of Newcastle and Lyme, are suffering because of cowboy waste disposals like Staffordshire Waste, who have now been again done for having waste that was not meant to be on site and have been given a notice by the Environment Agency. What support can I get in holding these people to account and making sure that their retrospective planning application for a site that they're using, which they didn't get planning permission on before using, is rejected by Stoke-on-Trent City Council?
Well, my honourable friend is right to raise this this issue of those kind of people, and indeed we often see them associated with fly tipping, which is a blight on our landscape. I will ensure that I raise all the issues that he has raised with me with my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Levelling Up, who has ministerial responsibility for this.
Rachel Vaskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Crisis mental health services are in crisis. Patients and families gaslit and at risk. It is Mental Health Awareness Week, but no government awareness to ensure my constituents are safe, nor funding and workforce needs met. So why is his government sat on their hands with a devastating report sat on the Health Secretary's desk? while patients in York and across the NHS are being failed. Can I and the Trust have an urgent meeting?
Well, I'm sure one of my ministerial colleagues in the health team will be happy to have that meeting. I would just say that under this government, we've put more money into mental health services, and actually we're funding 150 wider capital schemes. So this government has made mental health services a priority.
Final question, Virginia Crosby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week is Wales Tourism Week, an opportunity to celebrate one of Wales's most important businesses, which represents 10% of all jobs, supports Welsh farmers and food producers, and generates £6 billion in economic activity each year. Would the Deputy Prime Minister join me in thanking all those that work in the Wales tourism sector, and would he agree with me that this UK government's TIPS bill demonstrates its commitment to supporting the tourism sector, unlike Labour in Cardiff, whose proposed tourism tax will undermine visits and undermine jobs?
Well, of course, I'm most happy to give that commitment to my honourable friend. Indeed, I have spent many happy family holidays in Wales and plan to do so again next year.
That completes Prime Minister's questions.
And that brings us to the end of this week's PMQs, but with the deputies, with Oliver Dowden as Deputy Prime Minister and the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner. Let's introduce our guests for this part of Politics Live. For the Government, Transport Minister Hugh Merriman. For Labour, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Pat McFadden, and the BBC's Chief Political Correspondent, Nick Eardley. Well, without being rude, there wasn't a lot in that exchange that I could really take out or extract between the two of them. There was a little bit of knockout about. We talked before, Nick, that actually the gossip was that Oliver Dowden was a little bit nervous because it was the first time he'd actually had to do it. What did you make of it?
He does, though, prepare Rishi Sunak every week for Prime Minister's questions, and you could hear some of those familiar sound bites, couldn't you? I think the one that really landed was calling Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner the Holly and Phil of British politics. But it all felt a bit rehearsed to me. I'm not sure we really got much engagement on the substance of it. And I think the tricky question that Oliver Dowden didn't answer was the one about when he resigned. Remember, he quit. I think Angela Rayner said it was over the local elections. I think it was actually 2 by-elections, because I remember standing in Honiton when it came through that he'd resigned because the Tories had lost those seats that they'd held for years. But there is still that question. All the Tory MPs are asking it. Hugh, I'm sure you hear it from your colleagues as well. What was behind that pounding in the locals? How are you going to turn it around? I'm not sure Oliver Dowden really wanted to talk about it.
No, I'm sure he'll defer that to Rishi Sunak for next week. But we will pick up some of the issues with our guests. Let's look at this headline first of all. BBC News: Vauxhall maker warns Brexit may force it to close UK factory. This is one of the world's biggest car makers, called on the government to renegotiate part of the Brexit deal or risk losing parts of its car industry. This is Stellantis, which owns Vauxhall, Peugeot, Citroën and Fiat, had committed to making electric cars in the UK, but says that it's under threat. And it's to do, Hugh Merriman, with the fact that they will no longer be able to meet Brexit trade rules of origin, it's called, from where various parts are sourced. What does this say about the Brexit agreement that was negotiated by the government when you've got a car maker saying it's not going to work for them?
Well, that was one of the last pieces of the Brexit agreement to be agreed, that 45% of electric vehicle components would have to be manufactured in the UK or the EU to avoid tariff-free trade. So the challenge we've got both in the UK and the EU is that we don't have those battery factories set up. So what we are looking to do is to work with our partners in the European Union to see if it's possible to get some form of extension, because we're still not there ourselves and the EU in terms of battery production. It's something that we want to be. In this country, we have a fund, the Automotive Transformation Fund, which gives up to £1 billion to invest in this technology. Nissan are putting £1 billion of their own in, but obviously this takes time. And so we're working very closely now with our partners in Europe, and we have a renewed relationship with them to see if we can get some form of extension so that tariff doesn't kick in from next year as is currently planned.
Keir Starmer has said that he would look at the Brexit deal again. He would renegotiate it. What does he mean?
Well, on cars, this is really serious, because this is a cornerstone of our manufacturing industry. It's hugely important. When this deal was struck, we were promised 2 big things. One was there would be no tariffs, and the other was there would be no non-tariff barriers. Now, on non-tariff barriers, that's clearly been nonsense. There's huge costs and red tape for British businesses. But this is even more serious because this is threatening tariffs. So we need to do two things in response to this. First of all, try to extend the current arrangements to buy ourselves some time. But secondly, there's no point in doing that unless we catch up on battery factories, because at the heart of this is the truth that unless a country is making the batteries, in the longer term, it's unlikely to be making the cars. And the truth is, we have fallen behind in the race for battery factories. They're popping up all over Europe. It hasn't been happening here so far. And we've got to catch up and catch up fast.
We'll respond to that first of all, the holes in the Brexit agreement and in terms of battery production here.
Well, it can't be the case they're popping up across Europe, because if they were, we'd meet the requirement. We just have to make sure that the batteries are made in either the UK or Europe. The reason why the car manufacturers are concerned is because they're not being produced in either. So I don't accept Pat's point there. That would actually fix it if the EU did have battery plants in place. But I do accept that we actually need them across Europe and the UK, not least for our resilience.
Right,
as well.
but would you accept, Hugh Merriman, when Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister, promised tariff-free trade, that's not what we've got, have we, with this deal?
So in this particular instance, it will go up in 2024 if that component part can't make. Well, look, we've always actually had these type of restrictions in place in terms of the globe when we were members of the EU as well. So that's no different. But of course, as we strike out on our own, it means we're going to have to be more responsible and accountable on our own. But we end up with the positives of free trade deals across the globe. So ironically, you could end up in a better place trading outside of the EU, solving some of these issues, than being a member of the EU. There are always gives and takes.
One of the things that I haven't heard, when I asked you about renegotiating, what are you going to renegotiate? Are you going to reopen the Brexit treaty?
There are various gaps in this that we've talked about. For example, recognition of professional qualifications for service industries, which is really important. Participation in the Horizon scientific
scheme. But you could
scheme.
sort of do that aside. I mean, talking of reopening that Brexit treaty and a closer relationship with the EU, what would it mean in practice?
Well, it would mean those two things, hopefully. But this all has to be negotiated.
But what would you give up?
Nothing's a given. Wow. Then the third area should be a veterinary agreement, if we can get one. New Zealand has got one. Right. We've got massive red tape for our food and drink industries. And look, let's go back to the start of this. This is hugely serious. We are not in a better position if we lose the Vauxhall plants in this country. Or indeed, and by the way, Vauxhall won't be alone, because it will be the same rules for every car manufacturer. There is a distinct lack of urgency. There are battery manufacturing plants growing up in Europe. We have fallen behind on this, and if we fall behind further, it's a big threat to our whole automotive industry.
Hugh?
This took an awful lot to get this agreement in place. We've got it in place. If you want to reopen an agreement, you have to give up in order to get things. So the big question is not so much what are you going to seek to get, what are you going to give up in order to get it? And I think it would be a massive mistake, particularly when business needs certainty right now. So just looking at one particular rule and seeing if we can extend it for longer, fine. We managed to get the EU agreement with regards to Northern Ireland in place. We work well with our friends in the EU, but I don't think they want to reopen it, and nor do we. And I seem to think that Labour want to reopen it because they never believed in it in the first place.
Well, what do you say to Hugh?
The idea that we don't have uncertainty at the moment is ludicrous. Every investor we meet says that the political chaos that we've seen over the past years leads to huge uncertainty. There's already a built-in review of this in 2025 anyway. We can fill in some of the holes, deal with some of the non-tariff barriers, and actually deal with some of the costs and bureaucracy and the broken promises that have led to the situation that we're in. Broken promises on non-tariffs, and now possibly a broken promise.
You haven't actually said what you would give up on your side, but let me just show you this headline in the Financial Times. Number 10 hits out after Farage, Nigel Farage, former leader of the UK Independence Party, says Brexit has failed, something he has campaigned his whole life for. You agree with that, I presume?
Well, you know, I heard his comment, and he did remind me of some of the people in the old hard left who used to say the trouble with communism is it hasn't been tried properly. And that is what we're now hearing from some of the champions of this project, that somehow, I heard them say, it was all the fault of the politicians and this and that, and it hasn't really been implemented properly. The truth is we've had a number of broken promises on this. We've had broken promises on what this trade deal would mean. We had broken promises on Northern Ireland. We've had broken promises in other areas. We have to have a better relationship with the EU
Yeah, well,
without
you said...
rerunning the Brexit argument.
Well, that may be tricky. I'll come to you, Nick, in just a moment. But do you think Farage has got it right? Brexit's failed to you?
Funny enough, the last time I was on this programme, which was some time ago, we discussed the exact same thing that Nigel Farage had said. I think it was about 2 years ago, so it does tend to pop up.
Did he say that then, 2 years ago?
It was something quite similar, and we do hear it. It's never sort of good enough,
Did you say he was right then,
because...
and he's still right now?
No, I don't believe he's right then, I don't believe he's right now. And actually, if you do look, for example, at our ability to secure a vaccine when we had the COVID pandemic, which we were able to do... unlike our EU partners, that was a very good argument put by someone who sat in Nick's chair.
Yeah, but we could have done that, of course, as you know. We may not have chosen to do so, but we could have done that from within the EU, as we clarified, I think, at the time.
We wouldn't have been able to get the free trade agreements that we've put in place since I was last here. So, you know, there are some successes there, but things take time.
Well, one of the things, just before we move on, actually, Oliver Dowden made a bold statement, actually, about growth in the UK. He said that the UK had the fastest growth rate since Brexit in the G7. That's not true, is it?
Well, that will be for Oliver to account in terms of where he gets his statistics looking at it. I mean, we have seen growth in the last 3 months when we were predicted a recession. So we do feel the economy is growing. It's one of our 5 priorities to grow the economy. But, of course, we've got a difficult backdrop right now.
Right. We have the slowest growth in the G7, actually, since Brexit. Since we actually left the EU, so 2019, we have the slowest and the lowest growth since then. Do you think you should come back and correct that?
Again, I don't know which statistical starting point he's actually used, because you've just taken one. So he'll no doubt be able to give...
Brexit, and that is when we left the EU, you know, formally. Nick?
I know you both want to move on from the Brexit debates, but you both would have sat here 8 years ago and said the country would take a hit, the economy would take a hit economically if we left the European Union. It seems curious that nobody will say it now.
Why'd you say that, Nick? I mean, I'll confess, and it won't be a surprise to you, I was fairly sceptical about this project and thought it might not add up to everything that was promised for it. And I think as we see some of the consequences we're talking about today, that's the case. But acknowledging that doesn't mean where this always goes is, oh, if you say that, you must want to rerun the argument.
Well,
we don't want to put the country through this again, but that doesn't mean accepting everything as it is. Joe challenged me on what would we change. I've mentioned a few specifics.
But not what
These are things that could improve the position. But it is a negotiation. We'll have to sit round the table with people. But the difference between our approach and the approach of the Conservatives is we're not going to start from the point of view of blaming the EU for everything. We start from the point of view of wanting an adult and positive relationship with our fellow democracies across the Channel.
Hugh?
I think if you look at the relationship that this Prime Minister has got with the EU, that we're certainly not blaming everyone. We're working together with everyone. That's how we secured the framework agreement. Of course, we said there would be difficulties if we left the EU. That was pointed out at the time. But there would have been democratic difficulties if we'd not honoured what we said we would do, which is to leave if the majority of people who voted asked us to leave. And democracy is incredibly important, should be cherished, and we should be concerned unpicking it. And that's my point back to Pat, that it's all well and good to say, yes, we'll need to negotiate parts of it, but you have to work out what you're willing to give up.
Nobody is trying to unpick it.
Business doesn't need that uncertainty.
This is really important. No one is trying to unpick it, but that doesn't mean accepting the consequences of every broken promise that leading Brexiteers made.
We're going to talk a little bit about the local elections. It was raised a couple of times at Prime Minister's Questions with Oliver Dowden. Now, you may remember in the earlier part of the programme, we played Jacob Rees-Mogg, former Conservative Cabinet Minister, who's accusing his own party of gerrymandering, fixing voting rules to try and gain an advantage in elections with the introductions of voter ID. Let's just have a listen.
Parties that try and gerrymander end up finding that their clever scheme comes back to bite them, as, dare I say, we found by insisting on voter ID for elections. And we found that the people who didn't have ID were elderly, and they by and large voted Conservative. So we made it hard for our own voters, and we upset a system that worked perfectly well. It was one of the glories of our country, actually, that we did on an honesty basis, when the real problem is with postal voting. So don't get too fretful about random schemes brought up by the socialists, because gerrymandering doesn't really work.
Is he right? The voter ID scheme was brought in. It was a policy designed to give Tories an advantage in those local elections, Hugh?
No, not at all. It was just to update our our electoral system in the same way that most European countries have, which is to have photo ID. And also Northern Ireland, brought in under Labour, I may add, has been the case since 2003. And it was the Electoral Commission's recommendation in 2016 to do just this. It's what we've done. And in terms of older people, as is being pointed out there, wouldn't have the ability, then the bus pass suffices. So I don't get that argument at all. I think it's really important, again, to come back to preserving democracy, that we ensure that there is no fraud within democracy, or at least you reduce the chances of fraud, and that's what this does.
Right, but he was in the Cabinet. I think he was in the Cabinet at the time that the policy was discussed and brought in, and he's saying it was an attempt to, you know, fix the vote in favour of the Conservatives. Pretty astonishing.
He'll have to account for himself in terms of consistency. I'm of the firm view that this is the right thing to do. As I say, it's the majority of the European countries have it. We've had it in parts of the UK since 2003. And the Electoral Commission asked for it as well. So, you know, what's not to like?
Well, Keir Starmer, Labour leader, has also been talking about voting in elections, and this is to do with considering whether EU nationals who have worked and lived in the UK for a number of years should be given the vote in general elections. Let's listen.
Let's just take someone who's been here for 30 years, has literally put down their roots here. As I say, married to a Brit, their kids are here. This is their country, this is where they live, this is where they contribute. I think it's very hard to say, well, you should really be voting back in your country of origin where you haven't been living for 30 years. That actually just doesn't pass the common sense test for me.
You're in the shadow cabinet. Is Labour planning to make this a policy?
Well, at the moment, the situation is Commonwealth citizens who are not British citizens can vote here.
Some, I think, not all.
EU nationals can vote in local elections. There's no proposal to have a blanket policy where someone just arrives in the country and starts voting. But the example that Keir Starmer's using there is if someone has lived here for years, maybe decades, has paid taxes for a long time, are we going to forever deny them the right to vote? It's not a firm policy.
Should it be?
He's putting forward something that should be considered here, and I think it will be. And if I may, on voter ID, I spent a lot of time on doorsteps, as I'm sure Hugh and others did in the run-up to the recent local elections. There were problems with this system. People were confused by it. A number of people said they weren't going to vote at all. We'll never know about those because
they didn't go.
So what I want to see is proper evidence on the impact of this.
And there will be, no doubt, by the Electoral Commission and others. But let's stick on this idea of giving EU nationals who are living and working here. Let's find out a little bit more of the detail of what the current arrangements are with Lauren Tavriga from the BBC's Political Research Unit. Lauren, what is the situation?
Well, it's slightly complicated, Joe. Currently, EU citizens can't vote in UK general elections. There are a few exceptions to that. So EU countries who are in the Commonwealth, Cyprus and Malta, and also Irish nationals, they can vote in general elections. But when you get to the local level and also the devolved level, things get slightly more complex. So in Scotland and Wales, both in local elections and in their parliamentary elections, anyone with who's a legal resident is able to vote. And in England and also in Northern Ireland, currently EU citizens do have the vote in local elections. Now that's going to change slightly because the government introduced a piece of legislation last year called the Elections Act. This part hasn't come into effect just yet, but it's expected to at the end of this year. And what that will say is that if you arrived in the UK from Europe before the 31st of December 2020, so just before we formally left the EU, you will retain your right to vote. However, if you arrived after that date, you will now be subject to, your right to vote will be subject to the UK having an equivalent deal with your home EU nation. So if a UK citizen can vote in your country, you'll be able to vote here. Now, the UK does have a couple of agreements already, these reciprocal arrangements with Spain, Portugal, Luxembourg and also Poland. So some questions for your panel, Joe. To your Labour guest, I would say, why just EU citizens? If your argument is that people who have been paying taxes here for multiple decades should get the vote, should that not extend to all nationalities? And to your Conservative guest, I would say, well, is there not some kind of argument that if you have been paying taxes here for 3 decades and you've made a life in Britain, that you should maybe get a say in who governs you?
Lauren, thank you very much. Pat?
I think the answer to the question Lauren poses is kind of revealed in her summary there, where she said Commonwealth citizens already do have.
Yeah, but why not extend it to all migrants
well,
who've moved and they're living
as I say,
here and working here?
There isn't a firm proposal here at the moment. But
what's the basis then for only looking at EU nationals?
Because I guess that's the big disparity at the moment, where you've got this situation with Commonwealth citizens, but not with EU citizens, many of whom have been here for a long time.
Sure, but why the EU? There may be other groups of people who have been here for a very long time. We've got links with the Commonwealth, that's clear. Why especially France and Germany, for example, and not countries outside of the EU?
Well, as I say, we haven't got a firm proposal here yet, so this is something that Keir is raising because of this longevity of people staying who may not be citizens, but maybe residents paying tax and really settled in the UK.
Right, I mean, there is a logic to it, isn't it? If you've been here for 20, 30 years, you've built a life here, you might have had family here, you're working here, why not? Why not give them the vote?
Well, it's telling that this is all about the EU. And we hear from Labour that they accept that we've left the EU, yet the only people that are being talked about here that would actually get the vote are from the EU. And actually, I think that would be discriminatory. So not only have you got 4 million people from the EU who could potentially vote, surely that would have to be opened up to any foreign national. So I don't understand how that would pass muster. But also, to pin it towards taxation, for the Socialists to actually say no representation without taxation is somewhat ironic. And when push comes to shove with this, it just would not work. We do not have reciprocal rights. There are a couple of instances. Our UK citizens can't vote abroad, so why would you open it up? It appears to me it's opened up because there's a feeling that these people may be more likely to vote Labour, and I do worry about the message that sends out to the sort of purity of our democracy.
Oh, well...
There's no suggestion. I have no idea how they'd vote. It's up to any individual how they vote. It's got absolutely nothing to do with party preference. Why would you assume that someone from a particular country is going to vote Labour rather than
But why do it for just EU?
It's worth pointing out that you can do it at Scottish Parliament elections and Labour come third.
Oh, so what makes you think that they would be necessarily minded to vote for the Labour Party? I mean, in the way that Jacob Rees-Mogg seems to have discovered, if there was a thought about voter ID, it didn't favour older Conservative voters.
Look, I think if you looked at it and through the lens of saying EU voters here, did they actually want us to leave the European Union? The majority would not have done. Labour has always been seen as a pro-EU party in that regard, and that's why I come back to it. Why are you just having this for EU countries? Why not Swiss individuals who are over here paying tax for 30 years? Why not them?
Well, let's talk about housing. We talked about it in the first part of the programme, but it is worth looking at it again because it is becoming a very big political issue, and particularly since Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, has said he would contemplate allowing councils to build on the Greenbelt. Is that what he wants to do?
We discussed this the last time I was in as well. I think it's OK.
I'm repeating myself. But anyway, but I don't think Keir Starmer had said at that point that he would look at allowing councils to build on the Green Belt.
There's a really important debate to be had in the country about building more housing and indeed making it easier to build more generally, non-housing as well, infrastructure and so on too. And you know, we've got a housing problem that's obvious, but we've also got an investment problem where people tell us it takes far too long to build things.
Yeah.
So how are we going to do this? What is the right balance between local interests and national targets? And I know you always have fun because you find individual MPs who've opposed individual developments and so on.
Have I done that to you?
You can always do that.
Yes.
And there'll always be cases. But I do think having proper national targets to increase the rate of house building is the right thing.
Well, it is interesting. You're right. We do sometimes find those planning applications. The reason we talk about housing is because the politicians are talking about it a lot. But it seems in 2021 the Labour Party had a different view, so maybe he's changed his mind. We show you this tweet. The Conservative Developers Charter would sell off and sell out our communities. Local people, not Tory party donors, should decide what's best for where they live. So whose side are you on? Well, the people who own these nice houses in this bucolic scene set here behind that slogan. Do you want developers building on your green spaces without your say? Boris Johnson does, and so does Keir Starmer.
But what he said in his speech today is that local input is still really important. And we seem to have this black and white view that if you have a proper national housing target, you're going to ignore every local opinion. That's not the way it should be. Look, I don't know how well you know Wolverhampton. If you come to Wolverhampton, we have got many derelict factories, a legacy from the deindustrialisation of the 70s and 80s. They should be the first target. There is space there to build housing.
I understand.
And that's what we should do.
But why not the Green Belt, Hugh? Maybe it's time. There is a desperate housing shortage.
Well, we've built 2.2 million new homes since 2010. I should say we've enabled those homes to be built.
Woeful compared to what was actually needed and demanded in terms of affordable housing and social housing and so on.
Well, I mean, Pat talks about what can be done in urban centres, but you've got a Labour mayor in London that's built a lot fewer homes than the last Conservative mayor did. So judge us on a record. We've built those homes, but also we've built them in the urban parts as well. And, you know, it's all well and good when you're in opposition to say, well, actually, the Conservatives shouldn't do this, but then at the same time you put the adverts out to try and attract the other side of the argument. We've just had to get on and do it, and I believe we have.
We've only got a few seconds. Is this going to be the defining issue?
It's going to be one of them. It's certainly a big clash point within the Conservative Party and within Westminster politics, and it's a question of, do you cater for the people who own property already or for the ones who are trying to get into it?
That's all we have time for. From all of us, bye-bye.